Hello everyone, I'm Professor Paul Carrier, Western Michigan University Thomas M. Cooley Law School, and I'd like to provide some background information on the materials for Class 4 in the sales class, which deals with, again, negotiable instruments. We are still mostly in Article 3 of the Uniform Commercial Code. There is a lot of material for today, and some of it is quite specific. Luckily, it's relatively easily identified from the code provisions themselves that we will go over significantly in class, but I'd like to provide a general idea of what's going on, and so that you understand the nature of where we're going in today's class. And again, there's a lot of material, but it's not, even though it's voluminous, it is not overly complicated, and so I think that you'll catch the drift relatively easily. I'll begin with the main themes or rules so that you get a sense of where we're going, and then I'll provide certain specifics on some of the more important areas. If you do something with a negotiable instrument, if you create a negotiable instrument, that creation, where it's turned over, may suspend and in other cases even discharge the underlying liability. A quick example might be helpful. If I write you a check and hand you a check, you cannot sue me for the rent because I gave you the check. And the check doesn't necessarily absolve me yet, but there is a suspension. And if you take the check and you sue me, I don't have to pay unless and until the check has actually been dishonored. If it's been dishonored and I know about it, then I'm liable again. But I'm not liable, my bank is, the drawee bank, unless and until. Other cases, for example, a cashier's check received by somebody else. If somebody grabs a cashier's check as payment for a negotiable instrument obligation, that discharges the obligation. And in fact, we will learn that it discharges it in full. So if there's some remaining debts or problems outside of that, it's game over. There are other acts taken that do not suspend or do not discharge liability. We'll get into that again. Often it's with a note or it's with a draft, which is a check is a draft. And so, for example, when I write a check, you can't sue me. You've got to go to the drawee bank, which has the cash, and I've ordered that bank to pay. If you go to that bank, or you endorse it over and someone presents, and the check is dishonored, not paid, then you can't sue the bank because you have no agreement with that bank. But you can come back and sue me on the underlying obligation. I can go and sue my bank, the drawee bank, for not honoring its agreement to act as my drawee bank and to pay properly payable instruments. I use a term now, properly payable, which we will use again when we cover Article 4. Very important, properly payable. The properly payable rule of Article 4, it's Section 4-401. We will cover that further. Also very, very important for today is the concept of primary obligation and secondary obligation. If I write a note, if I make a promissory note, I am primarily liable. But the recipient payee who signs it over, the person who endorses after that, if it's been negotiated, those people do become liable for signing it over to other people who take it with the belief that this instrument is actually good and is payable. But keep in mind, there's a primary versus a secondary liability. Another way to think about it with a check. If I write a check and hand it over, it suspends my obligation, and so technically, I'm not the payer at that point, am I? My bank, the drawee bank, is the payer. So that bank is primarily responsible now, and I am not. If that bank does not pay, if the check is properly presented, and it is dishonored, then the suspension of my primary obligation for buying the bicycle, for example, is renewed. But remember, I write a check, I'm suspended. You come to sue me, you can't. You go to the bank and present, and you get your money, it's all over. You go to the bank and you don't get your money, it's been dishonored by the drawee bank. Now, you cannot go after that bank does not owe you any obligation. However, you can then, if there's been a presentment of dishonor, come back after me on that underlying obligation. And as you can imagine, I would only have to pay once. If the check is dishonored, my bank account at the drawee bank is not affected, and therefore I should have to pay because the bank isn't, I should. And of course, I can then go after my bank if the bank made a mistake in denying payment to someone else. Okay, so those are the main ideas. Again, very quickly, suspension and discharge of the obligations, the underlying obligations that relate to these negotiable instruments, and whether or not a person is primarily or secondarily liable on the negotiable instrument obligations. I already basically kind of mentioned that. The maker of a note is responsible primarily. The drawee of a check, of a draft, is primarily responsible. And those parties should be required to pay first if all others do not. And there can be an idea of priority, but at the end of the day, the person who actually makes a negotiable instrument should be the one who has to pay for the underlying obligation. Okay? That's not to say that you necessarily have to go straight to that source to collect. You might be able to go to secondarily liable parties, and then there are certain civil procedure mechanisms to try and shunt it. But, for example, I write a check, Mr. X signs it, and gives it to you for value. Mr. X, you could sue him if that check bounces. And then he would then come back and sue me because I gave it to him first, and it was perhaps there were not sufficient funds in the bank account. So do you see how in some cases that secondarily liable endorser could be made to pay? But then that person gets rights to come back after me. You would lose them if you're paid. And the person who had to pay you, we will learn in a week or two about the transfer and the presentment warranties. That person can ultimately come back to me. If I'm bankrupt or if I've disappeared, if you're a later person, you still can, under the proper circumstances, collect from a prior endorser who turned over an instrument letting you believe that everything was okay. Endorsed reliability, when someone signs a check, if someone signs as a co-maker, if someone signs as an endorser, that person would be secondarily liable. But keep this in mind under the rules. If endorsers sign, there may be a temporal priority, but there's not, as between that group of parties, any particular level of priority. And what I mean by that is, if you have 3 endorsers or 4 endorsers, and you want to sue the 4th, you can fourth amount, or entire amount of the negotiable instrument. And then that person, if he or she pays, can go after the others. If you take civil procedure, you might be able to interplead or implead, whichever is the proper term, those parties as well. But keep in mind, if it's not taken care of otherwise, the presumption is that those people have to pay the whole thing and then can go after the others who are further up the chain and also responsible. Okay, so if someone signs in the same capacity, liability is assumed to be equal. And then there may be some form of contribution as between those parties after payment has been made. When parties are secondarily liable, they are entitled to certain rights because we know there's a primary and there's a secondary. And there's also prior secondaries and later secondaries, which may also affect the nature of liability. There are rights of exoneration. I'll explain that in class. Subrogation. I'll explain that in class. Contribution, which I mentioned about 2 minutes earlier, and I think that you understand what that means. And the assumption of other rights, that's that strictissimi juris idea. So if you end up paying for something, and you are the one now to go and recollect in other places, if you have paid, and someone else in that chain didn't pay, but had certain rights to help ensure payment, for example, the existence of collateral, you have the right to get that. Let's say you as an endorser pay, and your payment now has left the collateral in limbo. Well, if you've paid, the person who has the right to secure the collateral, you've paid that person, you step in that person's shoes and you adopt the collateral. So now when you go back to seek payment of the party who's primarily responsible, if the collateral agreement was with a third party, it has gone to you now for your payment. and now you can use that collateral against the primary obligor. Okay. Very important. There's this idea of being a surety. You know the idea. You've heard about it in the past. You've seen it before. Well, in the code, we don't like to use the word surety. We like to use the word accommodation, well, the phrase, accommodation party. Someone who signs to help another who is, by definition, secondarily liable. You can accommodate as a signatory an endorser in any capacity. If you endorse as a maker, you can be sued as a maker. If you endorse as a transferee, you can be sued as a transferee. You can endorse as a co-drawer, as if I write a check and you sign below my name as a co-drawer, which is possible. There is a distinction with accommodation parties when they collect and who's responsible. There is this guarantee to future parties, which is of payment, and there's a guarantee of collection. And so if someone endorses to guarantee payment, he or she is co-liable, but for the full amount. If somebody signs as a guarantor for collection, then he or she needs to be it needs to be established for them that collection has been attempted and it has failed as against a more primary obligor. And once it's established that the more primary obligor does not pay, then the people who guarantee collection would be responsible as the endorsers to pay. With regard to some of the rules on preserving your rights as a secondarily liable party, those can obviously be waived. So if you say, I'm signing, the president of this company is responsible, I'm co-signing just to help him out and make it better, but I'm not primarily liable, well, you can give those rights away. He's primarily liable, so am I, have at it. And so that one of the cases particularly covers that issue. I mentioned this earlier, I'll bring it up again because it's important. A drawer, once he or she writes a check, suspends the obligation on the underlying contract or the underlying liability, because the instrument then subsumes it or merges it and it moves forward. And the drawee bank on a check, which is a draft, is the one who is supposed to pay. If he or she doesn't pay, he or she as a drawee bank might be responsible to the drawer, but is not responsible to the person trying to collect on that check. There's no agreement between the drawee bank and somebody collecting on a check. Okay, so the person who tries to collect on a check can't go after the drawee bank, but can try to go after the drawer if the piece of paper, the negotiable instrument, the draft, this check, has been presented, dishonored, and in some cases, notice of dishonor has been given. And that way we know the paper is basically null and void, rip it up, and now the underlying obligation that supported that check is back in play, and the person who's trying to receive the money as the payee or probably as a later endorser could then go after the drawer specifically. But keep in mind, if the money's supposed to be in the bank, the drawee bank is supposed to pay first. Okay? Another important thing in today's class, in today's materials, is the nature of liability when somebody signs as an agent. If agency is clear, the agent is not responsible for his or her signature on a negotiable instrument, that remains with the principal. If it's not clear and not proper to be proven, then that agent may be personally responsible as well as the principal. So there are some issues with regard to that agency. The best way to take care of that, make sure you indicate the principal, and when you sign your name, make sure to indicate that you're an agent of the principal at the same time. There are other ways around that if the evidence is there, but to be careful, that is the way to do it right. There was one more thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't write down, and I forgot it, and so I suppose that I will just have to remember it before the class this week. Okay, I'll see you in class.